This is a story that starts with the war in Vietnam, as you said. It's a story of vital interest to many of the 2.5 million GIs who served over there and their families. It's a story about illness that may be related to one of the chemical weapons we used over there. It's called Agent Orange. And those same ingredients, I might add, are being used right now in the United States in crop sprays and weed killers. As a matter of fact, the 2020 film crew took pictures of this kind of spraying just this morning near Washington, D.C. But part one of this two-part series concerns what happened during the war in Southeast Asia. And as you'll see, it's very much a story of today.
I died in Vietnam and didn't even know it.
What Paul Rudishan was talking about is cancer. Cancer and other diseases that he and at least 500 other Vietnam veterans are saying was caused because of exposure in Vietnam to the chemical spray used by the military to defoliate the jungles and fields of that war-torn country. It was a compound called Agent Orange. And between 1962 and 1970, when Congress finally ordered the spraying stopped, millions of acres of the countryside had been sprayed. According to the U.S. military, the idea was to kill the trees and vegetation being used as cover by their underground enemy. At the time, the enemy claimed the spray wasn't only killing the trees and crops, but was causing horrible damage to people and livestock as well. The North Vietnamese said that this so-called Agent Orange was inflicting skin disease, birth defects, hemorrhaging, spontaneous abortions, respiratory problems, liver disease, and even cancer among the people sprayed. They accused the United States back then of chemical warfare. But for years, those claims were dismissed as merely more communist propaganda, until our own scientists began researching the effects of the chemical compound. At the University of Wisconsin, researchers discovered that one of the elements in the substance, dioxin, was more toxic than mustard gas, the poison gas used in World War I. The team, led by Dr. James Allen, found that this dioxin caused cancer in lab animals at dosages 100,000 times less poisonous than the spray used in Vietnam. Dr. Allen has been studying the effects of dioxin poisoning for the last 15 years.
There are reports from the National Academy of Science. There are reports from English scientist Rose and Rose that interviewed people in Vietnam. There are reports from the North Vietnamese scientists that would indicate that there are difficulties, general alterations in general body health of those that were exposed, abnormal births from women that were exposed, general feeling of ill health, increased incidence of cancer. All of these have been reported from Vietnam. And even if we have a certain amount of reservations about these reports, we have to assume that at least there's a little truth to them. And that it came as really no surprise to me that veterans that were exposed to Agent Orange could be suffering ill effects from this exposure.
Dr. Allen's findings that dioxin may cause cancer have been supported by scientists in Sweden and in the United States, even by Dow Chemical itself, the nation's largest producer of herbicide spray. Dow scientists found that concentrations of dioxin less than that used in Vietnam caused cancer in laboratory rats. And the following organizations have labeled dioxin one of the most poisonous substances made by man: the Center for Disease Control, the National Academy of Sciences, the Federal Drug Administration, and virtually every other major scientific organization. Paul Rudishan served 2 years in Vietnam. Flying helicopters in combat, he often flew through clouds of Agent Orange. Last October, he began complaining of stomach pains, dizziness, and nausea. When the doctors checked him out, they found he was suffering from terminal cancer. He's 28. By their best estimates, he has between 2 months and a year to live. I interviewed him at his mother's house in upstate New York.
We flew missions in the same areas at the same time that they were defoliating. And being with the 20th Engineer Group over there, the engineers also defoliated areas around all the perimeters, and I was close to it all the time. But we had no idea then, no one ever told us that you were dealing with something deadly. I'm finding that the bureaucracy is very slow. They work very slow. I don't have time for slowness at this point, and that's why I've generated such a yelling, a screaming to let people know that something very dangerous is here. And I've met over 41 Vietnam veterans who have the symptoms and have their names and addresses, and I've suggested that they go see their doctor and get tests done, because these are my brothers. These are the people that went to war with me.
The possible connection between the use of Agent Orange in Vietnam and cancer and other diseases in Vietnam veterans was first noticed here, at the Chicago VA, by a benefits counselor named Maud DeVictor. She interviewed dozens of veterans suffering a range of symptoms and found a common denominator: exposure to Agent Orange.
I feel sad. I feel sad because I think of a guy that's laying in a hospital in Seattle, Washington, Albuquerque, New Mexico, Detroit, Michigan, who's on a respirator dying of cancer, who was at Vietnam, and he doesn't realize. I especially hurt for the guys who are incarcerated, the fellows who might already be in mental institution because the drug does induce psychosis and neurosis. I think about all those guys who just don't have the motivation to go to school. They just can't hack it physically. They just know they aren't functioning. They don't know why. It's just like walking around with a cloud over your head.
On Chicago's north side lives Charles Chapman and his family. A helicopter crew chief, Chapman was exposed to Agent Orange in Vietnam on an almost daily basis. A career soldier, now retired, he suffers from reduced hearing, numbness in his limbs, stomach problems, liver ailments, and worst of all, an emotional illness that sometimes induces violent outbursts.
Why I'm like this now? I don't know. I really don't know. Really, I do know I have changed. I am very hostile to people. I cannot get along with people.
Fred Wolf was one of the GIs sprayed with Agent Orange while it was being tested here in the United States. He was exposed again in Vietnam. Now he has throat cancer.
And you feel that this is service-related?
I definitely feel that it is. I have no other reason. You know, I've been healthy all my life. I've never been sick at anything, you know.
Do you feel a sense of anger now?
Well, I don't know what, who would I be angry at? You know, I just don't know how to express it. I just feel, I'm disappointed more than anything. You know, that something like this has happened to me, you know. You just can't, it's hard to accept.
Let alone being pregnant and having another child, not knowing whether your husband's going to live to raise that child. I think that since these men have taken care of their country and they went and fought for their country, I think that now that the government should take care of these men. I think they should support them and back them and their families.
I must indicate to you that the Veterans Administration, because of the way we're constructed and because of the interest of our administrator, himself a disabled Vietnam veteran, looks with great concern upon these allegations of disabilities resulting from exposure.
But have you made any awards to date to these people?
We have not made any awards on the basis of exposure to the herbicides. The mere fact that someone has a cancer and was in Vietnam, that coincidence, the fact, does not establish causation, I'm sure you would admit.
Absolutely.
And we are looking with compassion, concerned interest, as professionals, to see whether indeed there is such a link.
As this government film clearly shows, Agent Orange was handled with little or no safety gear by our troops. And this despite the fact that the defoliant spray contained potentially lethal amounts of the killer chemical dioxin. In 1976, a small town near the city of Milan in Italy became the unwilling testing ground for the effects of dioxin poisoning on a civilian population. There was an accidental explosion at a factory owned by a subsidiary of the Hoffman-LaRoche Chemical Company. A toxic cloud of dioxin escaped, Within a few days, the animals were dying. Cats, rabbits, even the wild birds who'd been flying over the now poisoned community. 700 people were evacuated from the most contaminated areas, but not until 2 weeks had passed, and not until dozens of people were stricken with the skin, liver, and neurological problems now being associated with dioxin poisoning. The grass and trees are green again, but the houses are still empty 2 years after an explosion released a poisonous cloud of chemical gas over this northern Italian town. And soldiers in anti-contamination gear and a long yellow fence are still here to keep the people out. Because of the long-range health implications, laboratories throughout Italy continue to study the effects of dioxin poisoning. Recently, the Italian government held a 2-day seminar for the world press and announced its preliminary findings. The people exposed to the dioxin had suffered only skin, nerve, and possibly liver damage, but nothing more serious. The drug company went so far as to say that no serious or lasting injuries were inflicted. But in an internal newsletter obtained by ABC News, the company added that the possibility of long-term illnesses could not be dismissed. Perhaps it would be more comforting to the rest of us to think of dioxin as something dangerous only long ago or far away. Unfortunately, that's not the case. During the war in Vietnam, this plant here in Verona, Missouri used to manufacture Agent Orange. Then after the Army and Air Force stopped using this stuff, it switched to the manufacture of hexachlorophene. But 2 years later, in 1972, the company went out of business. But when they left Verona, they left behind a huge problem. A steel tank containing 4,600 gallons of dioxin-contaminated waste. It's a poisonous brew that's already demonstrated its terrible power.
We calculated one time that with the dioxin that is in the tank, we could probably kill everybody in the city of St. Louis.
Although most of the Agent Orange used in Vietnam has now been destroyed, sprays containing the same toxic chemicals are still being used on forests, rice fields, and cattle ranges of the United States. The only difference is the spray being used domestically contains less of the poison dioxin, but at concentrations still considered dangerous by many world scientists. And as you'll see next week, the spraying has apparently had tragic consequences. In fairness to the chemical companies, and with all due respect to the vets who served in the longest and most unpopular war in our history, there is no conclusive proof that exposure to Agent Orange was positively responsible for the terrible diseases some of them are suffering from now or will be suffering from. And that's why the vets haven't been compensated yet, because down in Washington, they're still trying to figure out who should bear the burden of proof, the government who sent them over there, or the GIs who went and served their country. Next week, we'll be talking about how a particular chemical spray may be affecting the health and well-being of many people, right here, right now. You?
Geraldo, what should a Vietnam veteran do if he has reason to think that he's suffering either physically or mentally from exposure to Agent Orange?
Unfortunately, it's a lot like exposure to radiation. Once you're exposed, so there's nothing that can be done about the cause of it, but doctors can treat the effect, the symptoms. So if a vet thinks that he's suffering from the skin or nerve or liver or cancer even, diseases from exposure to Agent Orange, the first thing they should do is get right to their doctors. If they haven't had a checkup yet, they should get it, and get it soon.
Okay, we'll be watching for next week's report.